Hi there and good evening. Welcome to the Time of the Writer, day 5, and welcome to the dinner time event. And I think certainly we've got something to chew on with the subject that we're going to be talking about, because what you've tuned in for is the making of place, political, moral and ethical questions. And if that isn't something to chew on, well, I don't know. It's lovely to have you with us, and we're going to be talking to Tariq Mellet, Tariq Mellet, to Niq Mhlongo without his hat, and Shafinaz Hassim, and I'm Nancy Richards. I'm going to introduce you to our guest just a little bit more in more detail just now, but what I would like to say is that the Time of the Writer Festival would not be happening if it weren't for a huge amount of people who've invested heavily in time and energy and money. So to the funders and partners, we'd like to say a very big thank you to the University of KwaZulu-Natal, to the National Department of Arts and Culture, to the KZN Department of Arts and Culture, to the French Institute of South Africa, to the Stand Foundation, for the Foundation for Human Rights, with Human Rights Day coming up on Sunday, important, National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, to the Amazwi Museum for South African Literature. Media partner is Imbiza Journal for African Writing, and the technical partner is Hear My Voice, and these guys have been doing a sterling job so that you can hear our voices. And don't forget that if we would like to hear your voices, maybe not literally, but if you've got anything that you would like to contribute to the conversation, we'd be delighted to hear it, because it's a very broad-ranging topic that I think covers pretty much everything, and I think everybody will have something to say and feel about it. So if you'd like to do that, what you do is you go down to the bottom and you find the little Q&A box and you type in your question, and we have our illustrious panel will find a way to address what you have to say. So let me introduce you to our illustrious panel. I'm going to start with, I'm going in alphabetical order, just in case you're wondering. Patric Tariq Mellet. He was born and raised in Salt River, Woodstock and District 6. He's a former liberation cadre. He returned from exile in 1990, and the dissertation that he did in Buckinghamshire University was on heritage tourism, Cape slavery and Indigenous people. He's currently on the Governance Council of the SA Heritage Resources Agency, and he has a very long personal history of identities, multiple identities, which he will surely be sharing with us. He has a passion for engaging in film publishing and museology projects, and extremely interested, I must tell you right now, or extremely involved rather, in the creation of the Camisa Museum, which he's set to introduce South Africans to a decolonized history of Cape identities. It's opening very soon online. It's going to be at the Castle of Good Hope, and there's a great deal more to hear about it, and we will certainly give him the opportunity to tell us about that. He's also, interestingly, presently writing the biography of Red September, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that too. So sounds like you're a busy guy at the moment, Tariq, but nice that you could take the time to come and chat. Niq, next in alphabetical order, he without the hat. Niq was born and raised in Soweto. He's a multi-award winning writer and travel journalist who never stops traveling. He graduated from Wits University with a BA degree in African Literature and Political Studies. He's got 4 novels to his name, the latest of which is Paradise in Gaza. I'll show you the cover in just a minute. But he's also got a couple of collections of short stories, Affluenza and Under the Apricot Tree, as well as a recent collection of essays called Black Tax, Burden or Ubuntu, which is a topic in itself. And he's working on another collection of short stories coming out very soon. He's also written for comic magazines, television, various other media platforms, including in-flight magazines, which is not surprising because he spends so much time in the air. His work has been translated into many different languages, and his books have been prescribed in several international universities, interestingly. And many of his works have been adapted into play. He's been a writing fellow in several institutions in the US and Germany. He's worked for the Film and Publications Board. He was editor of the Johannesburg Review of Books, and he also taught script writing for a little while, which is interesting. And he's done creative writing courses right across Africa. Interestingly also that in 2019, he was a co-curator of the Time of the Writer Festival, so he knows all about this gig. So nice to have you with us, Niq. Last but by no means least, the other lady on the panel is Shafinaz Hassim. I have no idea where you were born, Shafinaz. I feel that's missing in your bio here, but nonetheless, she's a South African author and sociologist, and her award-winning writing spans many different genres, starting with her first book, Daughters Are Diamonds, Honor, Shame and Seclusion, A South African Perspective, looking at the autonomy of women in traditional settings. She lectured in sociology course based on that book. She has launched the Anthologies for Social Change. Her novel Sophia 2012 documented gender-based violence and was used as a text for social work students, also inspired performance theatre. She was listed by UNESCO as one of the top 39 writers in Africa under the age of 40. Are you still under the age of 40? You don't have to answer that question. And Pink Oysters has actually become the title of a collection of short stories that she's just written about, which we're going to hear as well. The Economics of Love and Happiness came out in 2019, and we've got that too. And she's also the author of Niq Mhlongo, is that right? I pronounced it right, which is a series for young adults all about a 10 or 11-year-old living in Johannesburg. So lots and lots to talk about, not least the work that you collectively are all producing. But nonetheless, the topic that we are going to undertake, that I am taking a deep breath because I'm thinking, where are we going to start? Because you've all written so copiously, I'm not going to sort of focus on any one particular book. However, this is Patric Tariq's book. It's called The Lie of 1652, which is a bit of a must read for any South African, I would like to say. Shafinaz, I found your novel at Sophia at the library. I went to the library to go and get it. Here was the anthology in which you feature your Pink Oysters story features, and the Economics of Love and Happiness, which is all about human trafficking. So nobody could say that you don't plunge in at the deep end with heavy political issues. And Niq, I've got two of your books. I had it just a minute ago. Oh, here it is. Affluenza, which I absolutely love. It's lots of short stories that are so revealing. And the very latest, which is Paradise in Gaza, which I've also just finished reading. So, my goodness me, where are we going to start? Where I thought we might start, instead of going straight to the topic in question. In terms, when you pick up your pen or your mouse or whatever it is with which you write, what is in your mind? Are you thinking, I have a message? Are you thinking, I have a drive? Are you thinking, this is political, ethical, or moral? When you start writing, where do you begin? Shafinaz, let's start with you, because you do cross a number of different genres. What's in your mind when you start writing?
I think my primary purpose for writing, thank you, Nancy, for the question. My primary purpose for writing, or where I began with writing, being trained in the social sciences, was to document what I was observing as a participant observer in many cases, and really to make sense and to make meaning of the spaces that we inhabit, because really we are enacting theater in spaces. But as just to zone in on the topic, I think we have a relationship with every city that we inhabit and that we visit for whatever space of time that we're in it. And it's inevitable as a writer that consciousness of the space that you inhabit and the relationship with the city, whether it's very emotional or sort of, you're there for a short space of time, just in transit, or whether you've grown there or whether you were born there. You mentioned you don't know where I was born. I realize I haven't publicly spoken about that. It is about creating these relationships just as you have relationships with the people you encounter. And that definitely comes through in the writing for almost any author, I would think, because how do you situate yourself in terms of I am in this body and I identify in a certain way? You also situate yourself in the spaces that you inhabit, and that relationship that forms is very emotive, it's political, and sometimes you have a choice for being there and sometimes you don't. For example, in a place where you're born, and that all comes through in the writing. So for me, even though I was born in Pretoria and I grew up in the Limpopo, in what was then Pietersburg, and I spent most of my adult life in Johannesburg, and most of my writing situates itself at the core in Johannesburg because that represents the most meaning for me as a city and as an entity, as something I have a relationship with. And it shows through, I think, quite profoundly in the Niq Mhlongo series, in the Economics of Love and Happiness, the young couple in Sophia, and in many of my stories, even though, I showed that there is travel to other cities, to other parts of the country, or to other parts of the world. it just, Johannesburg has this romance for me. It's the heartbeat of Africa, and it means everything. And I think it shows in my writing.
I think what you're saying sort of echoes what I've always felt about writers, is that you have a sort of heightened consciousness, because you talk about the relationship with the place in which you're born, or the relationship with the city in which you live. And I'm not sure that everybody does have a relationship with the city or the environment in which you find yourself. It's only when you start writing about it that it starts to send out messages that you then pick up. So that's very interesting what you say. And Pretoria, Limpopo, interesting. Hopefully we'll find out a little bit more about your relationship with both of those places. Niq, let's find out a little bit about you. I mean, I think you have a very strong relationship with Soweto, judging from your writing, but the relationship with your city in which you find yourself, just tell us your feelings.
I thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Time of the Writer, for inviting us here to talk about this topic. I would like just to say that I think most of the things that Shafinaz have said, I agree with them, actually, in a sense that just to add on what she has just said, I think I'm also writing to find a meaning, to get a meaning out of my own environment, because sometimes in environment, you might be born out of an environment, but you are a stranger and then an outsider within the environment that you are born in, and then you don't fit in, you don't necessarily fit in. So for me, it's more about writing to find a meaning, and then also writing to, find my identity. What is my identity? The more I observe things, is the more I understand myself and my relationship or my relation with this environment that I'm in. Shafinaz made a very important point of observing. I think that's what I do most, because that's why in most cases, if you look into my particular writing, for instance, I think many people have said that the strength is within the character, the characterization. I do well in characterization because my observation, I think, I focus more into observation as part of my writing process, because writing, I believe that it's a process in its own. When you observe, you are actually writing. When you are taking notes, you are actually writing. When you sit down behind the computer and type, you are writing. And when you're rewriting, you are writing. And you're rewriting again, you are writing. When you are editing yourself, you are writing as well. But I think where I find strength, it's in my observation. I think I'm a good observer of things, in a sense that I sort of live around people and make sure I mingle with the people that I write about. So that's the strength that I have. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, you talk about the observation, which I think is absolutely huge. And I've always thought that with writers, you must be constantly observing, taking things in, whether you write it down or just sort of absorb it. But the observation is one thing, Niq. The other thing is the processing of it, because it's one thing to observe it, but then you have to process it and then spew it out, or sort of interpret it in such a way that it's going to make it accessible. I'll come back to that, because I want to touch on something that you said. You write to find identity. Tariq, you would be writing every minute of every day of every week of every year, because you have so many identities. Your identity is something that you have worked on long and hard. So although you were born in District 6 Wood, or at least grew up in District 6 Woodstock and Salt River, there are tendrils within your genetics that span the world. So is your writing also to try and find your identity? Unmute yourself.
For me, the journey has sort of many beginnings. I grew up homeless, placeless. I was in 3 foster families before I was 7. I was in a Dickensian children's asylum for 4 years, which they called a children's home. It was far from being any home. And then I, slept in the loft of a vocational school, and when I was 15, I went out to work, and I didn't have much of an education. So my first port of call with writing was teaching myself. My first writing was on like toilet paper and newsprint and whatever, just to capture an idea, put it in my pocket and revisit it later. So it was part of a learning experience. The only place that in some small sense that I had to hold on to was where my father was born, where my mother and my aunt worked, and that was District 6. And of course, that was bashed down. They started bashing it down in 1966 to make it a white group area. The whole issue of I'm fairly Euro looking, and people wouldn't think of me as colored. So again, there's a whole range of things to work through. I didn't know my father. My mother was a single woman. She told me my father died in a motor car accident when I was small. So I didn't even have her name nor my father's name. I had another name that was given to me. I have my own name now. But for many years, right through to the age of 40, I carried somebody else's name. So even name didn't mean that much like it would to other people. And then in the liberation struggle, I had about 3 or 4 different names too. And I respond very well to "Hey you." It's a whole package of things. And then I get involved as a youngster, 15, 16 years old, in a trade union, and then in a political movement that's banned. I take up arms. I find myself in exile, traveling. Niq will know of Mahmoud Darwish, the famous Palestinian poet, whose almost every poem talks about rootlessness, homelessness, moving about, and the world becomes part of your home. My faith is multi-faith, it's syncretic. It has part Islam, it's part Christianity, part Buddhism, part African, Asian, animistic beliefs. So in all of this, race identity doesn't mean anything to me. Color identity doesn't mean anything to me. Ethnic identity doesn't mean anything to me. So what is it? What does mean something to me? So my search and my writing come together. And I came to this. If somebody asks me who you are, what you are, I say I'm born of a people who faced the greatest of adversities and rose above those adversities. That's my first port of call. And of course, through my life dedicated to the struggle, I am an African, and I am a Camisa African. And I explain this concept in my book, and also in the Camisa Museum. I come from a people who have over 195 roots of origin in Africa and Asia that come together in Cape Town. And it's through this voyage around myself and discovery of what identity means in those non-chauvinistic ways. And that's been very liberating. I took a resistance road very early in life, and we may not have gotten the kind of national liberation that we want, but I certainly have found a personal liberation in that journey. And I feel at home anywhere in the world. Niq, you'll have come to some of that feeling yourself. I'm at home in a mosque, I'm at home in a church, I'm at home in a Buddhist temple, I'm at home in a small shack with a shaman. That is all part of my journey of writing and exploring and wanting to share it with other people, because it has been such, I come from a very difficult and hardship background. But I will say to anybody that asks me, I have had a fortunate life, regardless of all of that, because of what I've been able to get from life. And when you got all this, you want to give it away. You want to, you want to infect other people with that legacy of what you've found. And it's such a narrow thing to want to define yourself by color, by race, by ethnicity, by nationalism, by a political ideology. I've been through all of those things, and there and back. and what I write about is all of that.
You know, what you're describing, and it really comes from the heart and from the gut. What you're describing is the exploratory aspect of writing, and I suppose as a you know, when one is starting out as a writer, you have to sort of explore what it is that you're thinking, and I suppose actually getting it out from your head and your heart through your hands and onto the paper helps you sort of access what it is that you're feeling. But the other half of the writing is what I was saying to Nick, is about the processing it, to sort of pass it on to your reader, to find out what it is, what message are you giving to them. So I can understand the sort of exploratory aspect of it. But I want to come back to, Shafinaz, what you were saying about the sort of let's come back to the making of place, you know, how do you can only really, I suppose, describe a place through your eyes, unless you're describing it through the eyes of one of your characters. How do you then do it? I mean, we all know that sort of screeds and screeds of description about the beautiful trees and the mountains and this and that and pathways, you're going to lose your readers. So what is it? How else is it that you can get that sense of place so that your reader can feel, I'm in that room, I'm in that city? How do you do that?
When I speak about a relationship with a place, I mean, you know, it will inform how characterization is sort of resolved and the feel for the story. But definitely, you know, it's not the same thing, because not every person, even in the same household, is going to have the same experience of place. And a relationship with a place is also not always going to be the best experience, because memory also informs, experience informs what happens if you've had a car crash at a certain corner, or you've had, you know, a romantic dinner at a certain place or whatever. Those kinds of things, and the taste of food informs how we feel about a place. So when it comes to characterization, I think as we develop the sense of finely observing, standing in a supermarket queue and realizing that every person's basket is different and tells a different story, or the way people articulate their words and their conversations, each in such different ways. All of this comes together and gives a different sensitivity to getting into the body of your character, because you're not writing, in fiction especially, you're not writing as you. So it is about taking on that mantle of a new character who may have had very different experiences from you, who may not actually like the place that you're inhabiting. But knowing a place does give you a keener sense of the spaces, the off-ramps, the dark and the light of being in that place, and the kind of interactions you can have. So it really is about empathizing with different forms of character and being able to develop character, and also taking note of different ways of different kinds of discourse. And by discourse, I mean the choice of words, the choice of clothing, and the way that people sort of create who they are when they're out in the theater and the politics of the city. And I think that needs to come through, because you sort of create this contract of trust with your reader, and a reader doesn't want to read a copy paste of your character in every one of your writings, and a city is a character. I think of your city, or that your story is situated in, is one of the characters of the book. And so the character also needs to be presented in an authentic way that fits the plot, that fits the eyes of the character that's viewing the city and experiencing that city. And all of that comes into the dynamic of an ethical presentation, an authentic presentation to your audience of what it means to situate that particular protagonist or the villain in your story, and the message that you're trying to convey.
You use the word authentic there, the authenticity of it. And you know what they say, I don't know who said it, but somebody said, write about what you know, because if you don't know it, it's not going to be authentic. Niq, for one who moves all over the place, when you're writing, do you have to have been to a place, to have felt it, touched it, smelt it? You know, does it have to be somewhere that you absolutely know? I'm just thinking about Paradise in Gaza. You know, do you know all these places? Is it essential? If you don't know them, do you need to go there to find it out?
No, you have to create them. That's the most important thing. If you don't know, you create. That's the purpose of writing as a writer. Coming back to, I'll give you an example. For instance, I wrote a book way back home. And when I wrote way back home, I wrote about the struggle, the ANC, I mean, what Tariq has been talking about, being in exile and whatever. But I've never been to exile. And I got invited by people outside South Africa thinking that I'm older. I've been to exile and I'll talk about the exile. And only to find out, no, I haven't been to those places. I haven't been to Angola that I've written about. By then, I hadn't been to Tanzania that I've been writing about. But I wrote about those places that I don't know with authority because I read a lot. I made a lot of research. I communicated with people that have been there. They gave me the picture of the place, And later, when I went to those places, like for instance, I went to Morogoro after the book has been published, I realized that what I've been describing is exactly what is there. I mean, the landscape and everything is there. That's why people that read it, that have been into exile, that have read the book, they think, wow, somebody, I might have had an inside information. So that just goes on to say that you don't need to be physically, being in a place doesn't need to be physical presence. Because if you need physical presence, it simply means that we cannot write about fantasy, So it means that we'll always write about realism, So which is not the purpose of the writer is to write about anything that they are sure about, or create the world that is authentic. I mean, George Orwell gave us in 1984, and I don't think he has lived in that particular world, So it's all about creativity, stretching your creativity from your comfort zone. So as authors, I think there are authors that are good at that. There are authors that rely on a specific place that they have been to. You have to write what you definitely know physically, but it's not always necessarily the case. We are here to create the world. Sometimes we create the world to live in the world that it's not even there. If ever we live in a world of COVID-19 now, a writer can create a world that is opposite what we're living today. So it's all about, I think what I'm trying to say is that a space in itself doesn't have to be physical. It's not physical. A space can be something that we hope for, in the future, so that's what I write actually. But at the moment I've realized that I'm competent when I'm writing about spaces that I've been to and spaces that I know, or spaces that I create, but based on particular places that I've been. I can name it anyway, but like Paradise in Gaza, there's no village named Paradise. There's no village named Gaza, but I used my knowledge of a village, of a particular village, taking that and other villages and putting them together to create the village that I want my characters to come from, so that I can manipulate them whenever I want to, so that I can manipulate my also my themes, because sometimes themes work well within a particular place and environment. So we have to create that environment if it doesn't exist, or if it's far away from us as writers.
Yeah, so there's something about being a writer where you in a way you play God, don't you? Because you can create anything you want, and you can just change things at a drop of a hat. And what you're saying, it's sort of like the difference between a sensory, physical, felt experience of a place versus research. Because you can research, I mean, sometimes you read a writer and they can take you down every street and every avenue and name the buildings, and you sort of feel as if you're walking around there. But you can do that with research as well. You don't have to have been there. It depends really how important the place is. I mean, you might be writing something, you don't necessarily have to know exactly what the place looks like. But let's park place for a moment and let's switch time frames, because Tariq, in your book, you know, which spans the entire history of South Africa, pre-colonial times, and we've gone from, you know, a complete span of many hundreds of years. So how is it writing from another era? Is that something where you have to maybe research and mentally sort of meditate your way into another headspace? Give us the time travel aspect.
If we take what Niq's just been saying, it first of all starts with imagination. You know, we were brought up with what was presented to us as a gospel history. But everything shouted out at us that this can't be accurate, this can't be true. And one of the things that, you know, is imprinted in a lot of South African minds is a painting that was done by Charles Bell in the 1830s. And it's a painting of Jan van Riebeeck arriving at Table Bay, and in front of him are the Khoi people looking at in awe with their hands up, that here they're seeing Europeans for the first time. And this was Charles Bell's imagination more than 200 years after the fact. And that imagination was presented to us as fact. And so starting off with challenging fact, reimagining, and then saying, okay, let me go down the research road. Let me try and find the pieces of the puzzle that may challenge that version. And one of the things that jumped out at me, because I was working in the maritime environment and so on, and by the way, Shafinaz, I focused on human trafficking as a law enforcement senior officer. And it relates directly to my passion about enslavement, because 26 of my family were brought to South Africa as enslaved people. But in this maritime environment, I had to work with visitor flows, and also in the aviation environment, visitor flows in and out of South Africa and so on. So I decided I will try and go back and look at, because there were a few things that jumped out at me from the pre-1652 history that said, this story is not quite right. And I was able to go and look at the ship logs. You know, between 1600 and 1652, there were over 1,072 Dutch ships alone, another 470 other European ships that came to Cape Town. And the numbers of people on board in total was, you know, close to 200,000 people. 100,000 definitely verifiable. And this, you cannot visit a place and there be no impact both ways, on indigenous people and from indigenous people onto Europeans. Was the port really founded by Jan van Riebeeck if it was operating for half a century before him, under indigenous people, because the Cape had not yet been colonized? And so my imagination challenged the authenticity of what is served to us as history. And then I was obligated to try and find the facts that prove that there's a different narrative. And many different narratives came out of that. The notion of an empty land, that the colonials came here and found an empty land. When I was able to go back into old African history around the peopling of South Africa, going back 3,000 years, there was enough in the academic and social sciences space to show me that every national group that exists today, Black national group, has a history that goes way back, you know, at least for 2,000 years, 3,000 years in Southern Africa. And so I wanted to know the facts of that. What societies existed? We know a whole lot of names now, Zulu, Xhosa, Venda, Pedi, whatever. What came before that? What were the names before that? What was the societies before that? That were the building stones, the foundation peoples of South Africa? Was it just the Khoi and the San, as people tell us? Or was there other groupings, like the Kalanga, like the Zizo culture, the Ziwa culture, the Rosvi Empire, the Mutapa Kingdom? All of those things began to become, it became addictive, that I just couldn't stop. Once I started to find one set of facts after the next that challenged the colonial history, it just made a whole new world there. Now, that brings up the question, what is the relationship of authenticity to morality, to politics? Because it was a political, ideological history that we were taught in a system called Christian national education and Bantu education that influenced us in this way for vested interests. And so everything in life has a political side, it has a moral, it's an ethical side. If we look at, just let's take the struggle. In the struggle, in the 70s and the 80s at least, the phrase that was most used was forward to people power. Now that term people power, Oliver Tambo really thought about this, because what he did was he went back to the term democracy, which comes from the Greek, demos kratos, people power. But what we got post-1994 was not people power, it was party power. And party power, corporate power, church power dominate. The people who are the majority are made small, and the corporate, the political estate, the church is big, larger than life. What is the morality? What is the ethic between these things? In the same way that I question colonialism, I have to question neocolonialism. When we see neocolonialism, not just across our continent, but we see it across Asia, we see it in Latin America, we even see it within the northern powers of minorities within the United States, Canada, Europe. So we have imagination, we have different notions of authenticity, we have the political soul of humanity, all here at stake, and we don't really talk about it, wrestle with it enough. And so the role of a writer, in a sense, is to exorcise, bring it out into the open, not necessarily plug a particular line, but to say, are we thinking about these things?
I'm going to Tariq, I'm going to just interrupt you there, because I think, are we going to sort of plug a particular line? I think it's quite an interesting aspect, because I'm just going to leave aside the sense of place and come to the politics and the morals and the ethics. And I come back to this thing about a message. When you're writing, are you consciously thinking, I'm going to put across a message here? You may have a particular topic, Shafinaz, in your case, human trafficking, gender-based violence. Do you go in with, I'm going to put this across with my view on the ethics and the moral? I'm just putting ethics, morals, and politics all together in one, which is quite an uncomfortable collection of bedfellows. But do you go in with, right, this is what I am saying about human trafficking, for example? Do you go in with that approach, or do you write the story and let that happen?
Looking at particular themes and topics that come up during the research phase, it's one thing to have the data, and it's one thing to know that this is a social issue that needs to be dealt with given the broader scope of society and the various actors that come together, law enforcement and and various and to find solutions. But my should I say, the leap I took, which was a huge shift for me, to move from documenting the data and the findings and to leap across into the world of fiction, which I first did with Sophia in 2012 with the domestic violence research, was to actually take a step back from my sort of very two-dimensional mindset, I suppose, and to find that third dimension and to say, is this really about documenting a message, or is it about really taking that extra leap of presenting those themes in the form of real characters, getting a feel and a sense of what it is to be in that space, and to actually broaden the scope and the reach of the conversation beyond the library shelf or the academic space. And I think there's a different power in being able to write in a way, and fiction is a vehicle for that, a different power in being able to reach and write in a way that creates the conversation, extends the conversation, maybe even challenges more of a conversation. Because reading about domestic violence or human trafficking in a very sort of clinical way is one thing. Seeing the scene set before your eyes, in a sort of third dimension, and seeing characters and seeing how children respond to a situation, and envisioning, expanding the imagination to envision that this can happen down the road, around the corner, in a town near me, or in my neighborhood, I think forces a change of thinking. Because it's very easy for us to say, well, this sort of thing doesn't happen, where I kind of live, or it's not that I know of, it's not such a big incidence, but just a few is enough to know that we have a problem that needs to be solved. And so if we do expand consciousness and change thinking, we bring more actors together to be able to put heads together for more solutions. And that in itself is a form of activism that one hopes can eventually sort of instate policy changes if needed, taken along the route. So I think that fiction is a form of activism. In that way.
I think the arts are a form of activism, and I think that's one of the whole purposes of the Time of the Writer Festival is to fly the flag and say the arts are essential if we're going to affect changes, what you said, forces a change of thinking, and expand consciousness. And Niq, what consciousness, what thinking were you wanting to, or what, if indeed you were wanting to change people's thinking, what consciousness did you want to expand with Paradise in Gaza? Because I was really interested in your dedication. You dedicated it to Credo Mutwa, from whose books I have learned a lot about African mythology and folklore. And as a white person, somebody who's not grown up with the sort of things that are in this book, it was really expanded my consciousness. It changed my thinking. Was that a conscious thing that you wanted to do with this particular book?
Yes, actually, in all my books, whenever I write, what I have, I always pick a particular theme, and that theme, it means that is the theme that I want to understand myself, perhaps, and also to share with others what I already know. So with Paradise in Gaza specifically, it's multi-layered. The themes are multi-layered. For instance, is the theme of I think what Tariq has just also said about land dispossession. I think is the theme, one of the themes that comes a lot in that book, and the fact that people that dispossessed others, like for instance the apartheid government that dispossessed a majority of black people of their land, what happens, they didn't understand the rootedness of Africans to the land. The rootedness in a sense that whenever, even you can, I mean, even when you go to the urban area, most people even in the urban area, they have got a rural land that they call home. Not necessarily because it's built in a nicely whatever things, but the fact that the ancestors, their umbilical cords come from there, they are rooted there. The fact that when I have to do libation, I have to go into that land is most important to me. But I wanted to also highlight the fact that that particular land that has been taken, you are taking somebody's identity. Because if you say now Niq is no longer going to the Limpopo area because now it's owned by Mr. van der Merwe, who wants to plant tomatoes, what about me, whose umbilical cord has been planted there, and also my ancestors' umbilical cords are planted there? What is the most important thing? Because If we look for physical food, we have to look also for spiritual food. This is spiritually, for me, it's spiritual. To you, spiritually might not be the case. But what I wanted to highlight is that is the lot of damage that has been done through such kind of land dispossession. What apartheid has done through influx control, through migration, process of migration, you know, women not being allowed to work, and all. So you are dismantling the roots of Africanness and the roots of our spirituality. So that was exactly what I wanted to talk about, what I wanted people to take home. Whether I did it well, I don't know, because people are still going to read. But the most important thing is that I've brought forward the debate that has been backgrounded by powerful forces. You know, it has been backgrounded and rendered as nothing, as not important. But to me, is the most important thing, because the problems of today, if it could be traced, it can be traced through there. You know, by taking people their identity. So the book itself, Paradise in Gaza, talks about the identity that has been taken away brutally by the apartheid forces. And the way also I wanted to highlight what I felt like it's not highlighted more, the role of women during the apartheid forces to bring families together. So you see my main characters in this book are mostly women who are very strong, and then who are affected by the process of migrant labor system, who are affected by influx control. It means that they cannot love. They are prescribed what to love. They are prescribed where to live. But on top of that, they manage to bring families together. And that's what today is happening, actually. Is because of the role of those women.
I mean, I totally sympathize with the plight of the writer, because that's a lot of messages that your consciousness, one doesn't just sit down and write, oh, this is such a fun thing to do. There's this sort of consciousness and conscience going on all the time, and it's your job to serve it in a way that's not palatable is the wrong word, but to make it accessible.
But so if I can add a little bit, I just wanted to make the point that just a little bit. Sometimes you write and you are not aware that about the message that you bring a certain message as a writer, but readers get certain messages. Like, for instance, I'll tell you about Dog Eat Dog. When we read it about it today, it's all about what is happening today of students' plight in the universities. Later on, when the movement Fees Must Fall came out, that's when people made me understand it. Remember, you wrote about it, but I was not aware, because when I was writing it, I was not aware. So sometimes we write about a particular thing, but we are not aware that it will come in a different way.
Well, that's why God gave us writers to channel things that are in the ether, so that you can bring them to people like a gift. I'm just looking at the time. We don't have so much time. If anybody who's watching would like to ask a question, you're most welcome to do so in the Q&A. And I also want to tell you that if you missed any of this and you want to hear it again, you can find it on the Time of the Writer Facebook page, and also on their Twitter account and on the YouTube. So I've got lots of questions actually, but I want to just divide the little time we have left. Shafinaz, I just want to ask you about writing for young people, because your series about Natasha Kamar, which you're just about to bring number 4, I want to know, at what point can one start infiltrating messages, politics, morals, and ethics into writing for young people? Niq, I think you might have worked a little bit with young people as well. That's my question for you, Shafinaz. And Tariq, I want to find out just a little bit about the Camisa Museum, because although it's not a written piece, a great deal of your headspace and written work is going to be exemplified there at the Camisa Museum. Shafinaz, I'm just going to start with you. At what point, when you write for young people, YA as they call it, how much do you sort of dumb down the messages, the politics, the morals? Shafinaz?
That's an interesting question. I'm thinking, especially the way you ended it, because what I'm learning more and more is that young people are not as impressionable as we would like to think. They're forming opinions, and they're very observant of what's going on around them, and very interactive in this age of information with everything at their fingertips. And so it's interesting. It's a challenge. But a beautiful challenge nonetheless. So when I started the Natasha Kamar series in 2016, it was a good versus evil adventure story about a 10-year-old little girl living in Johannesburg. And it was the kind of story I would have wanted to read back when I was a pre-teen. Because, you know, we weren't reading a lot of stories back then that were in South Africa. It was just about having a homegrown story. And also story is a wonderful way of bridging gaps for children of different communities, different races, different cities and towns. So I find Nisa has been able to do that as she's grown as a character. And when it comes to giving sort of morals and dynamics, I can refer to one conversation in particular where while book one was this triumph of good versus evil, and a lot of it comes through there, you know, instinctive stories that we've all been told growing up, there's a scene where the kids are talking about voting for, you know, for the current president, and not being able to vote because of the age of consent requirement, and saying, well, you know, children have opinions too. We're not tables and chairs. And if we don't understand something, we can always ask an adult. So there's a conversation that happens at their dinner table, not unlike the kind of political discussions that happen in our family. And so you see that children have an opinion, and you don't want to sort of, as you say, dumb it down, so to speak, but you just want to inject incidences where they can then reflect and form more of their own opinion, show them that they have the ability to expand on those ideas, and have those, you know, where you just don't have to pick up your hand and speak. If you have an opinion, that you also sit at the table, and that you're very much going to hear it. And I use Natasha Kamar to have those conversations in a fictional form, and to deal with, you know, whether it's issues of insecurity, clashes with a friend, or broader kind of observations of what's going on around them, and trying to solve mysteries, which are actually just problem solving, showing kids around that these sort of things are very much in their, you know, in their capacity. So, for example, in the Rainbow Healers Society, the kids of Joburg find a solution for bullying in the classroom, and they have the space where they can do homework and study groups together. And so there's this idea that coming together gives you strength and the ability to make find solutions for whatever problems kids might be facing as well. And book 4, which will come out later this year, looks at environmental issues, but it's also a big adventure that needs to be solved.
Gosh, that's quite a responsibility you've taken on, talking to young people and expanding their consciousness. Nick, I know you've got children. I'm dying to know if you've written any anything for children, if you've written any books, but just hold that thought, because I do want to give Tariq an opportunity to tell us about the Camisa Museum, because although it's not a work of writing, it's been informed by writing and research. And I think it's another way, museology is another way, it's another form of activism in a way, it's another way of putting across messages. So very briefly, what message are you hoping to put across, and how, with the Camisa Museum?
Nancy, you know, the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town, something like 45 to 50,000 children and their teachers visit the castle every year, and they do projects and so on. But up until now, the castle has not spoken to the history and the heritage of the majority Black population. It's an old colonial building. So we chose the site, and the CEO there, Calvin, is, you know, part of my team. We chose the site so that we already have the audience that's coming there, and it's a youthful and it's a teacher audience. What we've done is we've taken the whole Camisa concept, looking at the 7 major tributaries that inform and are our ancestral and cultural heritage, and the 195 roots of origin therein, and we tell the story. So this is less of what I call a squawk and gawk type museum. It's a place of learning, it's a place of memory, and it's a place of celebration and getting to be able to do the same kind of journey I did around myself, but for all our kids. And the Castle of Good Hope is also just right next door to where District 6 is. Now, just this week, my 10-year-old grandson got an assignment from his teacher that he must go and interview someone in his family or in their street and talk about where they're living and where they lived before and so on. And so we were able to take Celio to the spot in District 6 where now ETV Studios is built, which is built on the place where my father was born and where my grandparents lived. And he, as a 10-year-old, can go and see that. So he gets the tangible. And then he comes and he talks to me. And then he goes to the museum and he gets the further information. At the moment, he had to get all his information from me. What we're doing is creating a place where the restorative memory is there for the use of our teachers and our children. So we're starting first by having an online museum, which will be launched in the first week of April coming up. And it will be the entire museum online, accessible with all that information and so on. And it'll introduce you to all sorts of personalities over the past 400 years that people don't know about. And then we will set up a marker at the castle, build onto the physical museum. The whole issue about restorative memory, before restorative justice, you got to understand what happened. And District 6 is a very good example. Over 60,000 people were forcibly removed, but there are only 3,000 applicants for restitution, which has been whittled down to 900. Why? Because the restitution is based on people being able to show a title deed. Most of that 60,000 were in rented accommodation, so they don't get to have restorative justice. That's why restorative memory, what actually happened, is so important to today.
Yeah, and I think as somebody pointed out, everybody's memories, you can have two people who grow up in the same household who will have very different memories. Two people in the same street, as we know only too well. We just about out of time, but I do have one question for each and every one of you. Niq, I'm going to start with you because I do need to know if you've written any stories for your children or if you plan to write anything from young people, especially in the light of what Shafinaz has to say. So quickly tell me that, yes or no?
No, actually, but I've been asked to write is something that to write in an anthology by Helena Bila. So I'm going to attempt that. I haven't written so far. Yeah.
Okay. Then my question to each and every one of you: if you had one piece of advice for a writer, I'm not suggesting that any of you need to give us a Stephen King quote, but if you had any piece of advice that you would give a writer in terms of what we've been talking about, you know, the place, the politics, the morals, the message, the ethics, etc. Very simply, what would it be? Shafinaz, what would your advice be?
I think that in order to write, having a keen sense of people and place around you and being observant and putting yourself in the shoes of other people really, really goes a long way in developing characters. So observation and reading. You have to read if you want to write.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the first thing, isn't it? Observation and reading. Tariq, what would your advice be?
Similarly, look around you, take it all in, observe, listen to your gut, and dare to imagine. And when you've done those things, go and sweat the small stuff, go and find the facts. And with that tapestry of things together, you're going to write something. And I believe everybody can write. I was not very literate. I started off without much of an education. If I could do it, anybody can do it. And that's what I try to tell people, young, old, uneducated, educated, boys and girls. You know, you can do it. Don't let people tell you you can't.
Yeah, very, very. I hope people are listening to this very sage advice from all of you. Last but not least, Niq, what would your advice be? I know that you've done creative writing workshops all over the place. So,
well, first of all, I'll tell people to read Paradise in Gaza.
Okay.
And then, yeah. But second of all, I'll tell people to read. If you want to read about South Africa, the only way in which you can identify a gap that you want to write about, for instance, within the literary landscape of South Africa, is to read literature written by South Africans about South Africa. So start here at home, read a lot of South African literature, read things that you feel like they are related to what you are going to write about. Like, for instance, if you want to write about a particular epoch of history, it's more important to read right now about Tariq, for instance. That his book is got it all. So while reading that, you can identify some of the things that he might have misplaced, or he might not have developed more, and then focus on them. Same applies to when you want to write about children's stories. You know, many people say children's stories are scarce, so there are lots of them. If you look at them, read Shafinaz, read everyone else, you will definitely identify the stories that you feel like this is a story that needs to be told. When I wrote, for instance, way back home, one of the things that inspired me was the story that I had of a urban legend called Vera the Ghost. And I thought, I haven't read anything about Vera the Ghost. Let me write something related to it, you know? And then Way Back Home came out. It's because I read a lot about South African literature. So read a lot about South African literature, literature by South Africans, so that you can identify a theme, you know, that you can write about perfectly well. Yeah.
And where your little piece of the puzzle fits into the whole. What fabulously good advice, guys and girls. I'm going to rush off and start writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shafinaz, lovely. Thank you very much. Look forward to your new book very soon. And Niq, fantastic to see you back here in South Africa. It's where you belong. Enough of all this traveling now. And Tariq, I can't wait to see the Camisa Museum, whether it's online or physically in the flesh at the Cape of Castle of Good Hope. Thank you. Thank you all. It's been wonderful. And you take care. And as I say, if you've been listening and you missed the beginning bit, you can find it on Time of the Writer, the Facebook page, the YouTube, the Twitter account. It's so out there. To the Time of the Writer Festival, thank you very much for all that you've done. I think it's just brilliant. And don't forget, Sunday is Human Rights Day, and I think they've got a poetry special because it's also World Poetry Day. So that's something to know as well. Lovely. Bless you. Speak again. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.